On a frigid winter day in January 1996, 13-year-old Rachel Mellon Skemp was homesick from school in Bolingbrook, a suburb of Chicago. She spent the day with her stepfather, Vince Mellon, who was the only other person in the house. According to Vince's account, Rachel went to her bedroom to take a nap in the afternoon, and he left the house for about half an hour to walk the family dog. He said the front door was left unlocked, and that when he returned, he didn't immediately check on Rachel. It was only later that he realized the 13-year-old was missing. Rachel's absence ultimately came to light when her mother, Amy, arrived home from work that evening and went to tell Rachel that dinner was ready. To her shock, Rachel was gone. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle in the house, and all of Rachel's winter clothes and personal essentials, her coat, shoes, and purse, were still inside her room. Given the bitter cold weather that day, these abandoned belongings were an immediate red flag. The only things missing from the home were the blue blanket and 2 pillows from Rachel's bed. Family members and neighbors frantically searched the neighborhood and nearby park that night, but no trace of Rachel could be found. From the outset, investigators treated Rachel's disappearance as a likely crime rather than a runaway case. Police quickly focused on Rachel's stepfather, since he had been the last person to see her alive, and his account was the only narrative of events. Vince Mellon was brought in for questioning multiple times, and even took a lie detector test. According to police, he failed key portions of the polygraph exam. Meanwhile, authorities combed the area with search teams, dogs, and helicopters, but turned up no physical evidence pointing to Rachel's whereabouts. For Rachel's family and the community, the lack of answers was agonizing, and the case began to grow cold as weeks and months passed. A potential breakthrough came when police discovered Rachel's diary during a search of the home. In one extremely troubling journal entry from the summer before her disappearance, Rachel described how her stepfather had committed horrific acts against her. This revelation added a dark layer to the investigation, suggesting a possible motive for foul play. Acting on growing suspicions, a grand jury was convened in 2000, 4 years after Rachel went missing, to hear evidence in the case. Vince Mellon and Rachel's mother were subpoenaed to testify, and investigators obtained samples of Vince's blood, hair, and saliva as part of the probe. Despite these efforts, the grand jury ended without any indictments, and no one has ever been charged in connection with Rachel's disappearance. The case remained frustratingly stalled with circumstantial evidence pointing toward a crime, but no body or definitive proof to allow prosecutors to move forward. A consensus emerged among investigators. The most plausible explanation is that Rachel met with foul play inside her own home. The circumstances overwhelmingly suggested an inside job, and police have long considered Vince Mellon the prime suspect. He was the only adult present, and his timeline of events left a suspicious gap when Rachel could have been harmed. Further, the disturbing diary entry about Vince's inappropriate behavior towards Rachel only reinforced this theory in the eyes of law enforcement. Vince Mellon also had a documented history of violence, having previously had a restraining order put on him for pushing Rachel's mother down a flight of stairs. Disturbingly, despite all the circumstantial evidence, Rachel's mother chose to stand by her husband. Though to redeem your faith in humanity, at least somewhat, her father, Jeff Skemp, has been tireless in his efforts to get justice for his daughter for almost 30 years now. Rachel's case is one of those cases where I feel that the key to resolving the crime is significant sustained attention on her case. Unfortunately, Rachel's case doesn't appear to have attracted significant national media attention at the time. A summer night in Glacier National Park in Montana would transform into a horrific event, now known to history as the Night of the Grizzlies. The reason why this deeply disturbing set of events happened on a single night has been the subject of debate and scientific inquiry for over half a century. On the evening of August 12, 1967, Julie Helgeson and her boyfriend Roy Ducat hiked to Glacier's Granite Park Chalet, an isolated backcountry lodge. They set up camp roughly a quarter mile away from the chalet. The summer season had drawn many visitors to the area, and bears were known to roam near the chalet's garbage dump. The couple, both seasonal employees at a park lodge, slept under the stars in their sleeping bags. Shortly after midnight, a grizzly bear wandered into their campsite. Helgeson spotted the bear and urgently whispered to Ducat to play dead, hoping the animal would pass by. The bear, however, attacked the pair, knocking them out of their sleeping bags and mauling both. It then focused its rage on Helgeson, biting her severely and dragging her roughly 100 yards away into the darkness. Ducat, despite a badly injured arm, managed to run toward the chalet to seek help as Helgeson screamed for assistance. Other campers and chalet guests formed a search party, but fear and confusion delayed their pursuit of the bear. Nearly 2 hours passed before a rescue group felt it was safe enough to follow the blood trail and search for Helgeson. By the time she was found, Helgeson was gravely wounded. Rescuers brought her back to the chalet and did what they could to treat her injuries, but she succumbed to her wounds in the early morning hours. Roy Ducat would survive the ordeal, despite sustaining quite severe injuries in the mauling. In a separate incident only a few hours later on the morning of August 13th, another grisly attack unfolded about 6 miles away at a backcountry campsite by Trout Lake. Michelle Coons, also 19 and a summer employee at the park, had ventured to Trout Lake on August 12th with 4 friends, all of them co-workers from the Lake McDonald Lodge. They camped in an area that, unbeknownst to them, was the territory of a rather scrappy old grizzly bear. In fact, rangers later noted this animal habitually scavenged at a nearby dump site known as Kelly's Camp. This particular bear had a reputation for odd and aggressive behavior, and it had even chased a group of Girl Scouts just a week earlier. As the 5 young campers slept along Trout Lake, the grizzly entered their campsite. One woman awoke to the bear sniffing her sleeping bag, but she held still, and the bear moved on. When the animal began nosing Michelle Coons, Michelle woke and screamed in alarm. The sudden scream provoked the bear to attack. Michelle tried to escape, but the zipper on her sleeping bag jammed, trapping her inside. While Michelle struggled, her companions managed to scramble up nearby trees in an attempt to save themselves. Now, just as a quick bear safety public service announcement, you don't climb up a tree to avoid a bear. The bear mauled Michelle, dragged her roughly 300 feet into the woods, and disappeared into the night. Terrified, her friends remained in the trees for hours until daybreak. At dawn, they climbed down and hiked until they could find a park ranger station, where they breathlessly reported the attack. A search party later found Michelle's lifeless body. Park officials mobilized quickly once the attacks were reported. Although the 2 incidents turned out to be unrelated, 2 different bears were responsible. The fact that they occurred on the same night raised immediate alarm. Rangers and wildlife staff were dispatched to locate and eliminate any dangerous bears near the attack sites to prevent further harm. Glacier National Park's management gave orders to shoot any bear found in the vicinity of Trout Lake or Granite Park Chalet following the attacks. Over the next 2 days, rangers shot several grizzly bears suspected of involvement. By Monday, August 14th, a total of 4 grizzlies had been eliminated as part of the investigation. 2 of those bears were habituated to eating garbage around the Granite Park Chalet and were shot the day after Helgeson's attack. Another was slain near Trout Lake. An examination of its stomach contents revealed human hair and tissue, conclusively identifying it as the bear that had attacked Michelle Coons. This bear was notably emaciated, and even had bits of glass embedded in its gums, suggesting it had been desperately scavenging on trash. The final bear was a female with two cubs that was found back at the Granite Park area. Blood on her claws indicated she was likely the one that mauled Helgeson, though this wasn't confirmed with absolute certainty, as she may have come by after the initial assault. In the immediate aftermath, Glacier's rangers and even Federal Bureau of Investigation agents carefully documented the incidents. They collected evidence, such as bear hair and plaster casts of tracks, and performed necropsies on the culled bears to understand exactly what happened. The shocking nature of the two attacks prompted intense scrutiny. Park officials and biologists worked together to piece together the timeline of events and determine what factors had caused normally reclusive grizzlies to attack humans so savagely. It soon became clear that both incidents were the result of unusual circumstances that had been building for some time. As the investigation continued in the weeks and months after August 1967, the park also examined its own practices and history with bears. Rangers noted that just a few days before the attacks, they had filed reports warning that grizzlies were routinely feeding on garbage behind the Granite Park Chalet and around nearby campsites. In fact, allowing bears to scavenge on trash was a long-standing unofficial practice at some park facilities. The chalet's caretakers knew that having bears around was a popular tourist attraction and essentially just let more and more bears accumulate in the area. A trash incinerator installed in 1966 was too small to handle all the chalet's waste, so garbage was often dumped in a gully nearby, luring bears on a nightly basis. Word spread of this practice, and people went to the chalet with the sole purpose of seeing the bears attempt to gorge themselves on trash. At Trout Lake, investigators found the campsite littered with food waste. Indeed, in the weeks after Michelle's death, rangers removed nearly 20 bags of food garbage from the Trout Lake site. Glacier National Park had unknowingly set the stage for tragedy by allowing improper waste disposal and food habits to draw bears and people dangerously close together. In trying to understand how two fatal bear attacks could occur in one night, park officials and experts considered several major theories. One widely accepted explanation is that the bears had become food conditioned due to human negligence. In the mid-20th century, it was common in national parks for bears to feed on garbage left by visitors or at park dumps. At Glacier, the Granite Park Chalet had been effectively feeding bears its table scraps all summer, and the Trout Lake campground was full of litter. This habituation to human food caused the bears to lose their natural fear of people. Conversely, the human visitors started to lose their fear of bears as well, and felt more comfortable having them in proximity to campsites and cabins. The theory holds that by 1967, years of improper garbage management had taught some glacier grizzlies to treat humans and campsites as food sources, directly leading to the attacks. Interestingly, one theory suggests that the grizzlies had believed that the humans in their sleeping bags were actually the equivalent of the bags of food waste they would routinely tear open. While this is nearly universally accepted as one of the reasons for the attacks, this doesn't answer why these two attacks occurred on the very same night. On the night of August 12th, a lightning storm rolled through parts of Glacier Park. Some contemporary observers speculated that the thunder, lightning, and atmospheric electricity may have agitated the bears, making them more aggressive or unpredictable. Thunderstorms are known to affect animal behavior, and it was noted that the night's lightning was particularly intense. However, this theory remains largely speculative. While the storm was a noteworthy detail of that night, there is no direct evidence that it triggered the attacks. Park officials at the time could not conclusively link the lightning to the bears' actions, but it was considered as a possible contributing factor. Initially, many people viewed the two attacks as a freakishly rare coincidence, essentially a one-in-a-million event. In the 57 years that Glacier had been a national park, there hadn't been one single fatal event between a human and a grizzly bear. Statisticians noted that based on Glacier's record, the odds of even a single fatal mauling were extremely low, and the odds of two separate attacks on the same night were astronomically small. This led to the early belief that the night of the grizzlies was a fluke occurrence, a perfect storm of bad luck. However, many of the rangers believed that given the increasing conflict between grizzlies and humans over the course of the summer of '67, a fatal attack was imminent. They also noted that many more people than usual had been coming to Glacier that summer solely because grizzlies had become so common. Under this theory, all the data from previous years can't be meaningfully taken into account when conducting a statistical analysis. Every night over the summer of 1967 could have had a relatively significant chance of a grizzly mauling event. This is supported by the fact that there were close calls previously throughout the summer. Another theory, which was popular at the time, suggested that female bears were naturally aggressive towards women entering their territory. A bear's sense of smell is estimated to be about 2,000 times better than a human's sense of smell. Notably, their smell is about 10 times stronger than a bloodhound's in terms of detecting scents, and grizzlies can pick up smells from up to 20 miles away. Under this theory, female bears mistook women entering into their territory as some sort of female competitor or threat and eliminated them. This theory was later disproven, but it remains a popular urban myth to this day. Other more fringe theories suggest that the local wildlife essentially struck back against human encroachment into their traditional lands and territories. Ultimately, in practice, the night of the grizzlies did end up leading to increased respect for the natural lifestyles of the animals that inhabit national parks. While it's still not clear why two grizzly attacks occurred on the same night, the consensus now leans towards severe park mismanagement and tragic coincidence. In 1985, Charlie Sigmund married Ann Mitchum, who had two young sons from a previous marriage, and embraced her children as his own. Within a year, however, troubling signs emerged in their marriage. Charlie grew suspicious that Ann was having an affair and dabbling in the occult. In mid-1986, he reportedly found strange objects and books in their home, including a doll stuck with a needle that Ann said was for satanic rituals. On another night, Charlie caught Ann conducting what he believed was a satanic ritual in their shed, where she was surrounded by lit candles and chanting before a horned goat's image. Deeply disturbed, Charlie confronted Ann and asked her to leave. Ann moved out with her children and went to live with Gary Goff, a 43-year-old former police officer who, perhaps not coincidentally, was an old friend of Charlie's. Still, Charlie remained protective of Ann's boys. When Ann phoned on October 19, 1986, claiming the children were crying for him, Charlie immediately rushed to Goff's house to check on them and make sure they were okay. What happened next remains highly contentious, but what is known for sure is that Charlie was slain. In the early hours of October 20th, Ann burst into the Caruthersville, Missouri police station to report that her estranged husband, Charlie, had been slain at her boyfriend's home. Officers arrived to find Charlie's body with multiple wounds amid signs of a violent struggle. Ann and her boyfriend, Gary Goff, claimed Charlie had broken in and attacked Ann, forcing Goff to fire at him in self-defense. Investigators weren't entirely convinced by the self-defense story. With no hard evidence to contradict Ann and Goff's account, police initially released them. But days later, an informant came forward saying Ann had talked about wanting Charlie dead. Police had this friend wear a wire, and Ann was recorded making incriminating statements about needing to leave town. That was enough for a warrant, but Ann and Gary had already vanished, abandoning Ann's two young children. A nationwide manhunt followed. Weeks later, Goff's truck was found abandoned in Arizona, but there was no sign of the fugitives. In May 1989, Gary Goff resurfaced and surrendered to police in Missouri. He claimed they had split up while on the run, and that Anne had been granted powers by Satan, and even threatened to curse him if he turned himself in. And yeah, it was the 1980s, so throwing in some devil worship was par for the curse. Also, I realized that I had a typo in my script saying par for the curse instead of par for the course, but I decided to go with it given the context. Goff eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree slaying in Charlie's death and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Meanwhile, Anne Sigmund remained a fugitive. Authorities suspected she might be living under aliases like Andy Hayes or Andy Partlow in states like Oregon or Arizona, but every lead went cold and she's never been found. Notably, some have theorized that Gary Goff may have also eliminated Anne Sigmund, perhaps out of fears for her occult abilities. Alternatively, it's been suggested that he may have knocked her off because she was potentially in the position to strike a plea deal. Gary Goff was a former cop and definitely knew that if they were caught together, Anne would be a liability rather than an asset. Personally, given his law enforcement background, and given that he had already shown a capacity for extreme violence, this is the theory I tend to prefer. As for why Anne likely set up Charlie to be taken out, that also remains a mystery. While some believe that she wanted Charlie out of the picture for the purposes of a life insurance payout, this was never proven. Another theory is strongly rooted in the satanic panic that had gripped America during the 1980s. Under this theory, she lured Charlie over for the purposes of making a sacrifice to the devil. However, this remains highly speculative and also highly sensationalistic. If she's still alive, she would now be in her 80s, though of course there are reasons to doubt this. As for Gary Goff, he was sentenced for his involvement in Charlie's slaying and was released from prison in 2002. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with a reminder to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and most importantly, share this video on your socials and with your friends and family. Sharing my videos helps me spend way more time working on quality content to bring to you. Ball lightning is the name given to rare, glowing spheres that sometimes accompany thunderstorms, baffling, fascinating, and sometimes ending those who witness them. One of the most dramatic early accounts comes from 1638 in rural England. On an autumn Sunday, worshippers packed the village church of Widecombe-in-the-Moor in Devon, England, when a fierce thunderstorm struck. Without warning, an object described as a great ball of fire tore through a window of the church. The glowing sphere hurtled inside, bouncing wildly among the congregation. Panicked cries echoed as the fiery orb ripped part of the roof open and sent heavy oak beams crashing down. Witnesses described how it flashed and exploded with a thunderous noise, ending 4 people and injuring dozens more in the chaos. Some were found with strange burns on their skin, but curiously, their clothing was unscathed. To the 17th century villagers, it was a terrifying supernatural event, with some viewing it as some sort of judgment from God, while others viewed it as the work of Satan. Today, scientists believe this was an early record of ball lightning, one of the first detailed descriptions of its deadly power. Another early example comes about 5 centuries before, though the account isn't quite as dramatic. In 1295, an English monk recorded that a marvelous ball descended near London. He described a bright white sphere, which spun down into the River Thames. Centuries before electricity was understood, this medieval chronicler noted the orb's strange behavior with awe. In August 1753, science itself became a victim of ball lightning. On a stormy day in St. Petersburg, Russia, Professor Georg Richman rushed out with an iron rod and kite, attempting to replicate Benjamin Franklin's lightning experiment. As Richman and his colleagues stood by, a luminous ball formed on the kite's string. The fiery orb raced down the wet string, struck Richman's forehead, and essentially blew him up on the spot. The blast was so intense that it blew his shoes apart and left his clothing charred. Richmond's tragic demise, the first recorded scientist to fall victim to this phenomenon, underscored how dangerously real ball lightning could be. By the 1800s, ball lightning had become a staple of early science, with solving this mystery becoming a major fascination of many scientists. Ball lightning isn't just confined to old historical records, and until the 20th century, many scientists remained highly skeptical that it was even a real phenomenon due to its rarity. In fact, the 20th century brought some of the most astonishing eyewitness reports, convincing many skeptics that ball lightning is very real. One famous incident occurred in 1963 aboard an Eastern Airlines flight flying through a thunderstorm. Shortly after a regular lightning flash struck the plane, a glowing sphere the size of a basketball emerged in the passenger cabin. Stunned passengers watched as this silent ball of light drifted down the aisle of the airliner, maintaining a steady height and course. A physicist on board later described how the orb glided past rows of seats before disappearing. It gave off no heat and didn't scorch anything, yet it was clearly visible as a free-floating ball of light inside a metal airplane. Equally startling are reports from ordinary homes. In one ball lightning encounter from the 1970s, a woman in England was sitting in her living room during a storm when a grapefruit-sized ball came straight through her closed window. The glowing orb floated at shoulder height for about 10 seconds, wobbling slightly, and then vanished with a sudden loud bang. Over the years, scientists have proposed a range of ideas to make sense of these glowing orbs. One leading hypothesis today is essentially chemical. When a regular lightning bolt strikes the ground, it might vaporize certain minerals in the soil into a hot, charged gas. This cloud of vaporized minerals could coalesce into a glowing plasma ball that floats above the ground, gradually cooling and shining for a few seconds. In 2012, researchers in China captured a ball lightning event on high-speed cameras, and the light spectrum revealed vaporized elements like silicon, iron, and calcium in the orb. The chemical spark hypothesis fits many reports, especially those where ball lightning is seen right after a lightning bolt hits soil or sand. As the glowing globule burns off those elements in air, it would shine like a hot ember until it fades or explodes. This model neatly explains why some ball lightning lives only a moment and often appears after a lightning impact on the ground. Another popular theory envisions ball lightning as a kind of electromagnetic bubble. In this scenario, the lightning bolt that precedes the orb isn't just delivering electricity to the ground, it's also pumping out a burst of microwave radiation. Some scientists suggest that if those microwaves become trapped in a spherical pocket of ionized air, they could sustain a glowing ball of electricity. The microwaves bouncing inside keep ionizing the air, so the sphere stays lit for a while, even after the initial lightning bolt is gone. Not all explanations are so straightforward. Some researchers have ventured into more exotic territory. A few have wondered if ball lightning might be triggered by subatomic reactions, or even antimatter. Others noted the odd psychological effects of lightning strikes and proposed that ball lightning could be an optical illusion or a hallucination induced in our brains by magnetic fields. Could it be that people only think they see a floating ball when it's really a trick of the mind after a close lightning flash? Most scientists are skeptical of the hallucination idea, especially since ball lightning has been seen by multiple people at once and photographed and recorded. However, proponents of the hallucination theory argue that this is just one of many explanations for ball lightning, and not the sole cause. People from outside the scientific community have also suggested paranormal explanations for ball lightning. For instance, some have proposed that ball lightning is a physical manifestation of spiritual energy. Others have proposed that it's a supernatural entity, or ghost light type phenomenon. These ideas remain quite popular, because science simply doesn't have any firm answers the further you go down the ball lightning rabbit hole. At any rate, these are just a few of the dozens upon dozens of theories that have been put forth over the last centuries. Personally, this topic has been a major fascination of mine since I saw what I believe to be ball lightning hovering over a lake. That said, I was camping and had just woken up and went to bed right after, so perhaps the whole thing was a dream. Adan Manzano, a 27-year-old sports anchor and reporter for Telemundo Kansas City, was found dead in his hotel room in Kenner, Louisiana on February 5th, 2025. He was in the New Orleans area to cover Super Bowl 59 as his hometown Kansas City Chiefs were set to play in the championship. Manzano's sudden death during Super Bowl week shocked colleagues and viewers. There were no immediate signs of trauma on his body, and authorities awaited further tests to determine the cause of death. The tragedy was also personal. About a year before his death, Manzano had lost his wife in a car accident and was left raising their young daughter as a single father. Manzano failed to show up for a scheduled work meeting on February 5th, prompting hotel staff to check his room. He was found unresponsive and later pronounced dead. Given the timing and the fact that he was believed to be in good health, police immediately treated the death as suspicious. Investigators noticed that some of Manzano's personal belongings, including his cell phone and credit card, were missing from the hotel room. Security footage provided a crucial lead. Around 5 a.m., on the day of his death, Manzano was seen on hotel surveillance cameras entering his room with an unknown woman. About an hour later, that woman left the room alone, and Manzano never emerged again. This discovery launched a full-scale investigation as detectives worked to identify the woman in the video and determine what transpired during that early morning hour. Police quickly identified the woman from the footage as 48-year-old Danette Colbert, a resident of nearby Slidell, Louisiana. Evidence against Colbert mounted rapidly. Investigators tracked the use of Manzano's stolen credit card and found that it had been used at a New Orleans gas station and multiple stores shortly after his death. Both the missing phone and credit card were later recovered at Colbert's residence, further tying her to the incident. Within days, Colbert was located and arrested on fraud and theft charges for allegedly stealing and using Manzano's credit cards. At the time of her arrest, authorities had not yet charged her with crimes directly related to Manzano's death, but she was considered a person of interest as the investigation continued. Colbert's arrest was accompanied by disturbing revelations about her past, but I'll get back to that in a moment. Due to the circumstances, a judge ordered Colbert held without bond, deeming her a flight risk and potential danger to the public based on her criminal history. A significant breakthrough in the case came when preliminary toxicology results were disclosed later in February. During a court hearing, a detective testified that Manzano's system tested positive for a powerful prescription sedative with a high potential to be misused. Investigators noted that Manzano did not have a prescription for this or any similar substance. Authorities noted that this detail was crucial, as benzos are often used in crimes to incapacitate victims before robbing them. As the investigation progressed, Colbert's background came under intense scrutiny. It turned out that this wasn't the first time she had been implicated in crimes involving dosing and robbing unsuspecting victims. Law enforcement officials revealed that she's a career criminal with a long rap sheet across multiple jurisdictions. She had been first arrested in New Orleans as far back as 2012, and over the years had faced charges for robbery, fraud, and even battery, often pleading guilty and receiving probation. Notably, in 2022, Colbert was arrested twice in Las Vegas on felony charges of grand larceny and administering substances to commit a felony. In those Vegas cases, she was accused of meeting men in hotels, dosing them until they passed out, and then stealing valuables. Notably, both Nevada cases were later dismissed when the victims declined to testify, perhaps for fear of what happened in Vegas not staying in Vegas, but the pattern was clear. Colbert returned to New Orleans thereafter and continued to rack up arrests on theft and fraud charges. Police in New Orleans were well aware of her modus operandi. The police chief noted that Colbert was known to prowl the French Quarter looking for potential marks amongst the crowd. Based on the evidence and Colbert's background, the leading theory at present is that Manzano's death wasn't intentionally caused, at least in the most strict definition of the word intentional. Rather, the authorities believe it was the result of a disturbing scheme to administer substances to Manzano and rob him, hoping that he would be too embarrassed to go to the authorities. Her reckless dosing of the unsuspecting Manzano is believed but not yet confirmed to be the reason for Manzano's death. The authorities are now looking into the possibility that other individuals were affected by Colbert's disturbing theft strategy. Authorities allege that she has operated in both New Orleans and Las Vegas, and there's the potential that further victims may come forth or may be uncovered in the future. In late September 1944, the quiet town of Mattoon, Illinois was seized by an unusual panic. Residents began waking in the dead of night to a sickening, sweet odor filling their homes, followed by alarming symptoms including nausea, weakness, and even temporary paralysis. Several victims claimed to glimpse a shadowy figure fleeing into the darkness, leading to rumors that a mysterious prowler was creeping up to houses and spraying gas through open windows. Before long, this supposed phantom attacker earned an ominous nickname, the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. The scare began to grip the town on the night of September 1st, 1944. Aline Kearney was at home with her young daughter and sister when she noticed an overpowering, sweet odor in her bedroom. Moments later, Aline experienced partial paralysis of her legs and a burning sensation in her throat, rendering her unable to move or call for help. After a couple minutes, she was finally able to yelp for help. Her sister rushed in and caught the strange smell as well, discovering it seemed to be coming through the open window. That same night, Aline's husband returned home and spotted a tall, thin man dressed in dark clothes and wearing a tight-fitting mask lurking outside their window. The stranger fled into the darkness as soon as he was seen. Aline's frightening symptoms subsided after about 30 minutes, but the mysterious gas attack had set the stage for further terror. The next morning, a local paper broke the story with a bold headline declaring that a quote-unquote anesthetic prowler was on the loose in Mattoon. News of the bizarre incident spread quickly, and soon other residents came forward with similar tales. A nearby couple reported that they had been awakened by a strange, sweet odor the night before the Kearney incident, after which both became sick and partially paralyzed for over an hour. Another woman claimed she may have had a comparable attack much earlier in the summer, suggesting the gasser might have tested out his method of attack even earlier. On the same night as the Kearney case, another woman was up late when she heard a faint sound outside and then smelled an odd odor that made her legs and hands go numb. Yet another report described an unnamed mother whose children began vomiting after a sweet smell filled their home. Within days, multiple households around Mattoon recounted these eerie encounters, creating a timeline of terror that spanned the first 2 weeks of September 1944. As the reports multiplied, a pattern emerged. Most victims were women who had been at home at night, and many described the gas's scent as sweet or perfumed. Symptoms consistently included nausea, throat irritation, and temporary paralysis or weakness in the limbs. By September 5th, a particularly chilling piece of physical evidence turned up. A resident named Beulah Cords found a mysterious damp white cloth on her front porch and picked it up out of curiosity. I believe there's a saying about cats and curiosity that applies to situations like this, especially when there's rumors of a madman on the loose. The cloth emitted a noxious odor that immediately sickened her. She felt as if she'd received an electric shock. Her face swelled, and her throat burned. Beulah was violently ill for hours afterward, and she later speculated that the rag had been left to knock out her dog so the prowler could approach the house unnoticed. Alongside the cloth, police recovered a key and an empty tube of lipstick on the sidewalk near the porch. These strange items suggested to the authorities that an intruder might have been attempting to enter homes. Over the next several days, Mattoon's crisis only intensified. On September 6th, no fewer than half a dozen new incidents were logged around town. Entire families fell ill from mysterious fumes, and one man caught a fleeting glimpse of a tall, thin figure sprinting away from his property, which he believed was the gasser escaping. The following nights brought more significant alarm. In one home, two sisters experienced 3 repeat gas attacks and even described seeing a thin blue vapor as well as machinery outside their window. By September 10th, the tally of reported victims had risen into the dozens. One local paper noted 33 people had smelled the gas over 12 days. Mattoon was in a frenzy, and the elusive anesthetic prowler seemed to vanish into the shadows each time, without leaving solid proof of his identity. The growing desperation in the town was palpable as people wondered who would be hit next. Authorities responded to the escalating panic with urgency. Mattoon City Police increased nighttime patrols and even enlisted help from state and federal officers, including the FBI, to hunt for the so-called Mad Gasser. Armed citizens formed vigilante groups to guard neighborhoods after dark, determined to protect their families from the phantom assailant. Roadblocks were set up and volunteers kept watch on porches, yet despite the heightened alert, no one was ever caught in the act. Investigators looked for any tangible evidence that could crack the case. They examined the mysterious cloth from Beulah Cord's porch in a laboratory, hoping to identify a chemical or poison, but tests revealed nothing. Police also noted other odd clues reported by citizens, such as footprints found beneath windows and cuts in window screen mesh, but none of these led to a concrete suspect. The authorities compiled a list of unusual individuals and local characters who might fit the phantom anesthetist profile, and speculation ran rampant. However, despite following up on numerous leads, the authorities never could find any perpetrator or perpetrators behind the attacks, if any attacks did indeed take place. In the aftermath of the incident, 3 main theories emerged to explain the Mad Gasser mystery. The explanation that gained the most acceptance was that the events were a classic case of mass hysteria. Sociologists and psychologists frequently cite the events in Mattoon as a textbook example of mass hysteria and collective panic. According to this theory, the rash of reports was driven by anxiety. World War II was at its height, and many local men were overseas, facing constant threats. The ones who stayed behind were largely working long hours in local factories. Further, Allied countries had been advised by their governments to be wary of Axis agents in their midst. The people of Mattoon were under significant stress, and once the idea of a gas maniac took hold, every unusual odor or faint symptom triggered real fear reactions. Neighbors exchanged stories that amplified the panic, and sensational newspaper headlines fueled the fire further. In short, under this theory, the community unwittingly manifested a phantom out of collective stress and suggestion. This mass hysteria explanation accounts for why no confirmed physical evidence was ever found to conclusively identify a gas or an attacker. Further, it also explains why the reports stopped as soon as authority figures challenged the reality of the attacks. However, not everyone is convinced that hysteria alone explains Mattoon's strange 2-week terror. Some residents and researchers believe there may indeed have been a real attacker lurking that September. After all, A number of witnesses were adamant that they saw a tall, sinister figure wearing dark clothing prowling around their properties at night. The Kearney's sighting became the template for the Mad Gasser's image, but interestingly, one later witness described the prowler as possibly a woman disguised in men's clothing. Some have speculated that a woman could have been overlooked by authorities because investigators simply couldn't accept that the criminal wasn't a man. Another variant of the real assailant theory suggests that an Axis agent or an Axis sympathizer may have actually been active in Mattoon. Under this theory, this agent may have picked Mattoon since it was located in the soft underbelly of America. Conducting such an attack in such a place may have been, in essence, a last-ditch psychological operation by Axis agents to demoralize the American people. Further, some have theorized that evidence of the reality of the attacks was found once the FBI was called in, but that the true nature of the attacks was covered up for reasons of national security. Personally, I think that this theory may have carried some weight in 1944, but given that we're now over 80 years on, I suspect this would have been declassified. Another prominent explanation at the time was industrial pollution, or an industrial accident. Notably, the police chief suggested that any number of the nearby factories may have released any number of toxic chemicals which could have had similar effects. Despite the competing theories, the general consensus at present is that the Mad Gasser was very likely a mass hysteria event. That said, the Mad Gasser being a collective delusion doesn't really solve the mystery of why this event happened localized in Mattoon at the time it did. The pressures faced by the town were largely the same as any other small town across America during the war, so what confluence of factors made Mattoon special? Hey everyone, Jimmy here once again reminding you to subscribe and share if you haven't done so already. Now let's get back to business. On January 27, 1993, two young girls made a grim find along a wooded roadside in Wayne Fitzgerald State Park near the town of Ina, Illinois. They had stumbled upon a woman's head, with no sign of the rest of her body in the area. Investigators noted she had extensive dental work and had signs of having worn braces in the past, clues that strongly hinted that she had been well cared for in her youth. Due to the location of the discovery, the unknown woman became known as the Ina Jane Doe, a name that would stand in for her identity for nearly 3 decades. From the start, authorities treated the case as a slaying, and the removal of her head was presumed to be an attempt to hinder identification. Despite forensic examination, the victim's identity remained elusive, and the trail of leads quickly grew cold. Forensic experts carefully examined the remains and estimated her age to be between 30 and 50 years old, a significant miscalculation that may have prevented her identification. An examination of the skull and upper vertebrae suggested a distinctive medical condition which might have caused her head to tilt to one side during her life. This led police to believe the woman's posture or facial features could have appeared asymmetrical. Early on, a sketch and a clay facial reconstruction were created to portray the victim with the suspected leftward head tilt and facial asymmetry. Notably, these attempts were intended to exaggerate the asymmetry to make her most distinct feature more noticeable. While this has worked well on a number of other cases, unfortunately, as you'll see shortly, Ina Jane Doe's face wasn't just not asymmetrical, her face was very symmetrical, and her neck was fine. These highly distinctive images, along with details of her dental work, were distributed in hopes of finding a match among missing persons. Unfortunately, no results were returned, and months passed into years without any new information. Unbeknownst to Illinois authorities at the time, a parallel mystery was unfolding 175 miles away in Clarksville, Tennessee. On Christmas Eve of 1992, just 1 month before the head was found, 25-year-old Susan Lund, a local mother of three, vanished without a trace. Susan, who was about 3 months pregnant, had left her home on foot around 7:30 p.m. to buy groceries at a nearby store, but the market had closed early and she never returned home. Her husband, Paul Lund, became alarmed the next morning when Susan was still missing, and he contacted the Clarksville police to report her disappearance. A multi-agency search was launched and continued for weeks. Early reports noted that Susan might have been upset about the family's financial situation around that time, but there was no concrete evidence explaining her sudden vanishing. After about 2 weeks, police began to scale back the active search amid unconfirmed sightings of Susan in nearby Hopkinsville, Kentucky. Then, in a strange twist, a woman in Alabama came forward in August 1993 claiming to be Susan Lund and told a state trooper she did not want to be bothered. Now let me remind you, so you don't have to rewind, the Ina Jane Doe was discovered in January 1993. Based on this encounter, authorities in mid-1993 concluded that Susan had left voluntarily, and they closed the missing person case as resolved. Susan's family was incredulous at this outcome, and they personally traveled to Alabama and confirmed the woman was an imposter. In a further unusual twist, the authorities decided to believe the imposter over Susan's family and refused to reopen the investigation. For nearly 29 years, the Ina Jane Doe's identity and Susan Lund's fate remained parallel, unsolved puzzles. The case in Illinois periodically drew interest from detectives and amateur sleuths, but without new evidence, it remained stagnant. In early 2021, hope resurfaced when Dr. Amy Michael, a forensic anthropologist, offered to re-examine the Jane Doe case with modern techniques. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Office welcomed her fresh eyes on the case and provided the preserved remains and case files to Dr. Michael's team. Dr. Michael and her team conducted a detailed reanalysis of the skull and archival records. They discovered that the victim's facial asymmetry had likely been much milder in life than initially thought. This finding suggested that the original reconstructions might have distorted her appearance and severely hindered any potential recognition. Determined to correct the record, the team commissioned a new, more accurate forensic sketch. And this is one of those times you may want to check your screen if you're just watching, because I've put the reconstruction beside the forensic sketch, and it's night and day. Investigators circulated the new renderings in hopes that someone would finally recognize the long-lost victim. At the same time, due to the increased attention on her case, forensic DNA technology was brought to bear. In 2021, samples from the unknown woman's remains were sent to a specialized lab in California to extract DNA suitable for genealogical analysis. By early 2022, scientists had obtained a usable genetic profile from the remains and uploaded it to a public genealogy database. Remarkably, within 1 day, the forensic genealogists found multiple close DNA matches pointing to a particular family tree. They identified a couple in that family who had a missing daughter named Susan Lund, and tellingly, this daughter had no recorded activity after 1992. Law enforcement followed up by contacting Susan's siblings, one of whom provided a DNA sample for direct comparison. On March 6, 2022, nearly 30 years after the crime, officials confirmed that Susan Lund was indeed the Ina Jane Doe. This breakthrough solved two mysteries at once: an unidentified victim in Illinois and a missing persons case in Tennessee, but it also marked the beginning of a renewed hunt for the perpetrator. The identification of the Ina Jane Doe as Susan Lund was a watershed moment for both Susan's family and the investigators. Susan's relatives, including her sisters and now adult children, were overcome with mixed emotions. They felt profound relief at finally knowing what happened to her and anger and sorrow at the suffering she endured. Detectives from Illinois began coordinating with authorities in Clarksville to piece together Susan's final days and generate new leads. One chilling clue that emerged after Susan's identity was established came from old reports in Illinois. Several campers and fishermen recalled seeing a headless body in a lake around the time the head was discovered in 1993. Oddly, it appears these reports were never fully pursued, meaning Susan's body may have simply been left in the lake. At present, there's a lot of theories going around about what may have happened. One theory focuses on the possibility of domestic foul play. Susan's husband, Paul Lund, was the last known person to see her alive, and some have speculated about the possibility of his involvement. Internet sleuths have speculated that Susan may have recently informed her husband that she was pregnant, leading to an outbreak of violence. However, it must be noted that Paul Lund was never charged and has never officially been named as a suspect. Further, he died in 2020, 2 years before Susan was identified. Another avenue of speculation posits that Susan Lund fell victim to an unknown predator or serial perpetrator. Susan disappeared while walking alone at night, and her remains were found across state lines, which could indicate a random abduction by someone passing through the area. Anyway, with all that said, I hope to have a further update on Susan Lund at some point in the near future. The glass delusion was a peculiar psychiatric phenomenon recorded in Europe during the late Middle Ages and early modern period. Individuals suffering from this delusion believed that they were made of glass and feared that any sudden movement or impact would cause them to shatter into pieces. Such people often refused to be touched or even approached, convinced that the slightest contact could break their fragile glass-like bodies. Notably, this condition was most frequently observed among the educated upper classes. Early modern physicians and writers classified it as an unusual manifestation of melancholy. This was essentially an extreme anxiety or fear within the framework of humoral medicine. One of the most famous sufferers of the glass delusion was King Charles VI of France, who lived between 1368 and 1422. Charles VI ascended the throne as a boy and was initially known as Charles the Beloved for his enlightened leadership. However, he experienced a mental breakdown in 1392 that marked the onset of a lifelong psychosis. During his bouts of insanity, Charles became convinced that his body was entirely made of glass. He refused to allow anyone to touch him and took elaborate precautions to avoid shattering. For example, the king would sit motionless for hours, sometimes wrapped in thick blankets to protect himself. He even wore specially made garments reinforced with iron rods, described as iron ribs, to safeguard his supposedly fragile glass organs. These bizarre behaviors earned him the epithet Charles the Mad amongst later historians. Charles VI's case is often cited as the first known instance of glass delusion in history, and it vividly illustrates how real and debilitating this belief was for the afflicted individual. In the 15th through the 17th centuries, the glass delusion cropped up in royal courts, monasteries, and universities across Europe. An influential 16th century account by a court physician told of an unnamed nobleman who believed he was made of glass. Specifically, he believed his body was actually a glass vase. This nobleman reportedly spent long periods lying on a bed of straw to avoid cracking himself. According to the story, his doctor devised a dramatic cure. The physician set the straw on fire and locked the door, forcing the panicked patient to frantically pound on the walls for help. When the man didn't shatter from this vigorous slamming, the doctor allegedly challenged his delusion, and the nobleman came to realize that he wasn't truly made of glass. This anecdote, whether apocryphal or factual, suggests that even in the 1500s, doctors recognized the delusion as a false belief and attempted creative psychological interventions to treat it. Notably, some modern scholars question whether such a delusion could be broken so easily, given what we now know about mental health conditions. Many variations of the glass delusion were documented. Some patients believed only a part of their body was glass, for instance, a glass head, glass arms, or a glass heart that could splinter inside them. A particularly widespread fear, apparently affecting men in particular, was that the sufferer had acquired a quote-unquote glass buttocks. Men who held this belief would avoid sitting down without some padding, fearing that their posterior would shatter upon contact with a hard seat. Contemporary medical theory in the late medieval and Renaissance periods explained the glass delusion within the prevailing framework of melancholia. Melancholy, associated with an excess of black bile in traditional medicine, was thought to produce all manner of fears and false beliefs. Robert Burton's The Anatomy of Melancholy, released in 1621, famously catalogues a variety of bizarre delusions afflicting people with melancholy. He noted that some people believe they're made of glass, while others believe that they're made of lead or cork or other materials. Treatments were largely empirical and compassionate in nature. Physicians might gently reason with patients, or, as in the case of the straw bed fire cure, try to shock the patient back to his senses. The approach indicates that doctors understood the problem to lie in the patient's belief, rather than in any physical issues within the body. Modern scholars have proposed additional explanations for why the glass delusion appeared when and where it did. Glass was a rare and valuable product at the time, and some have seen it as almost the equivalent of having been touched by Midas himself, if Midas turned objects into high-quality glass. One psychological interpretation is that cases like King Charles VI represent early descriptions of severe mental illness on the psychotic spectrum. Retrospective diagnosis is speculative, but some historians and psychiatrists have suggested that Charles VI's condition might be described today as schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder. Indeed, chronic schizophrenia often involves false beliefs about one's body, and the glass delusion could be seen as a culturally shaped version of that clinical phenomenon. Notably, the glass delusion was both time-bound and culture-bound. By the late 17th century, cases of glass delusion had all but disappeared, with only a few cases reported throughout the entirety of the 20th century.